Hey, tonight we are going to solve one of the most persistent myths in the history of furniture. Medieval beds were not short because medieval people were short. I want to get that out of the way immediately because that is the explanation that has been circulating in popular history for decades, that appears in museum tour scripts and history documentaries and pub quiz answers, and that is wrong in ways that are interesting enough to keep us occupied for the rest of this evening. The medieval bed was short. This is true. The surviving examples, the ones in museums, the ones in the great houses that have maintained their original furnishings, the ones depicted in the manuscript illustrations and the paintings of the period, are shorter than a modern bed by a significant margin. A bed designed for a single adult in the medieval period might be as short as 5 feet long. A generous medieval bed might be 5.5 feet. The bed in which Henry VII of England is believed to have slept, which survives and is on display, and which was made for a king who had the resources to commission whatever he wanted, is not what a modern person would consider a full-length bed. And the explanation that gets offered for this, that medieval people were short, and therefore their beds were short, and there is nothing more interesting here than the average height of the medieval population, is the explanation of someone who has not thought carefully about what the evidence actually shows. The average height of the medieval person was not dramatically different from the average height of the modern person. Archaeological evidence from medieval skeletons across Europe gives us a picture of medieval stature that is shorter than the modern average, by a few centimeters, perhaps 5 or 6 centimeters in the male average, but not by the amount that would explain beds that were a foot or more shorter than modern beds. The people who slept in these beds were not 5 feet tall. They were approximately as tall as their beds were short, which means they were not lying flat in them in the way that we assume they were. They were not lying flat. This is the key. The medieval bed was short not because the people sleeping in it were short, but because the people sleeping in it were not sleeping flat. They were sleeping propped up, semi-recumbent, with their backs elevated on a wedge of pillows and bolsters, at an angle that could be anything from a gentle incline to something approaching sitting up. And the reason they were sleeping this way, the specific combination of medical theory, social practice, architectural reality, and the specific character of the medieval knight that produced the semi-upright sleeping position, is the actual story. And it is considerably more interesting than a story about short people. Tonight, we are going to follow the medieval person to bed. We are going to understand the bed itself, the object, what it was made of, what it contained, what it cost, what it meant. We are going to understand the room in which the bed sat, and what that room was for, and who else was in it. We are going to understand the theory of why sleeping upright was the right thing to do, and the practice of how you actually slept in a medieval bed. And we are going to understand the night itself, the medieval night, which was different from our night in ways that go beyond the absence of electric light, and that shaped the experience of going to sleep and being asleep in ways that the modern person has mostly forgotten. Before we begin, like the video if a night spent understanding why you are sleeping wrong by medieval standards sounds like what you needed. Subscribe so you never run out of history to fall asleep to. Drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I always want to know who is out there in the dark, lying flat when they should be propped up. Dim the lights. Adjust your pillows. This is History in Sleep. Let us go to bed. The bed. Why it was short, and what that actually means. The medieval bed was an object of extraordinary significance that the modern world has almost entirely misunderstood by looking at the wrong thing. When people look at a medieval bed and conclude that it was short because medieval people were short,
They are looking at the physical dimensions of the object and inferring the biology of the people who used it. This is reasonable in principle, but it requires the assumption that the people sleeping in the bed were sleeping in the same position that a modern person sleeping in a modern bed would sleep in: horizontal, flat, stretched out to their full length. And this assumption is wrong. The medieval bed was short, not because the medieval person was short, but because the medieval person was sleeping at an angle, propped up by a structure of pillows and bolsters, and the effective length required for a person sleeping at an angle is considerably less than the effective length required for the same person sleeping flat. The evidence for the propped-up sleeping position is substantial and comes from multiple independent sources.
The manuscript illustrations of the medieval period, the illuminated manuscripts that depicted scenes of domestic life, the medical texts that showed patients in bed, the religious narratives that showed the dying or the sick in their beds, consistently show figures in bed at an angle rather than flat. The bolsters and the multiple pillows that are visible in these illustrations are not decorative. They are structural. They are what is holding the sleeper upright. The documentary evidence confirms the illustrative evidence. The inventories of medieval households, the careful lists of possessions that were produced when estates were valued or when households were transferred, consistently list multiple pillows and bolsters as standard bed equipment. A single bed might be inventoried with 2, 3, or 4 bolsters and multiple pillows. This is not the equipment of a person who intends to lie flat. This is the equipment of a person who intends to construct a supported, angled sleeping surface. The medical literature of the medieval period provides the theoretical justification for the propped-up position. The Galenic medical theory that dominated medieval medicine held that the body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that the proper functioning of the body depended on the correct flow and balance of these humours. Sleep, in this theory, was the period during which the humours underwent their nightly redistribution, a process that required the correct positioning of the body to allow the humours to flow in the right directions. The specific fear was that lying flat allowed the brain to be overwhelmed by humours rising from the stomach during the process of digestion. The digestion of the evening meal, which in many medieval households was taken not long before sleep, produced vapors that, if the sleeper was lying flat, would rise toward the brain and produce dangerous effects. The semi-upright sleeping position was the prescribed remedy for this. By keeping the head elevated above the stomach, the sleeper ensured that the digestive vapors had further to travel and would be cooled and dispersed before they reached the brain. The specific recommendation for the angle of elevation varied across the medical authorities of the period. Some recommended a gentle incline. Others recommended something more pronounced. The general principle, head higher than the stomach, which was higher than the feet, was consistent across the tradition. And the consistent presence of the bolsters and the multiple pillows in the inventories and the illustrations suggests that the recommendation was taken seriously in practice, at least by those households wealthy enough to have the bedding required to implement it. The bolster, the long, cylindrical cushion that formed the base of the medieval bed's support structure, was the primary structural element. Placed at the head of the bed and elevated on the bed frame or on additional supports, the bolster formed the base of the inclined surface on which the sleeper reclined. The pillows placed on top of the bolster added additional elevation and comfort. The result was a supported, angled sleeping surface that could be customized to the individual sleeper's preference by adding or removing pillows. The bed frame itself was designed for this arrangement. The medieval bed frame was typically a rectangular structure of substantial wooden beams, supporting a mattress or a network of ropes or wooden slats. The head of the bed was often elevated slightly by the design of the frame.
the headboard being higher than the footboard, creating a gentle rake that complemented the bolster arrangement.
This combination of structural incline and bolster support produced the sleeping angle that the medical tradition prescribed and that the practical experience of the medieval world had found over centuries to be comfortable enough for regular use. The mattress that sat on the bed frame was stuffed with whatever materials were available and affordable. The wealthiest households used feather mattresses, the down and feathers of geese and ducks, gathered and cleaned and stuffed into linen ticking in quantities that produced a thick, soft, yielding sleeping surface.
The less wealthy used wool or straw or a combination of these, the quality of the filling being one of the primary indicators of the household's wealth. The poorest households slept on straw pallets directly on the floor, with no bed frame and no bolsters, and the specific comfort of the propped-up sleeping position was available only to those who could afford the bedding to achieve it. The size of the medieval bed, the width as much as the length, was also determined by considerations that the modern person might not immediately recognize.
The medieval bed was often wide because multiple people slept in it. The sharing of beds by people who were not related or intimate, the practice of bundling and bed sharing that was standard in medieval and early modern households, meant that a single bed might accommodate 2, 3, or more adults simultaneously. The width required to accommodate multiple people was the primary driver of the wide medieval bed, and the shortness was the consequence of the sleeping angle rather than the height of the occupants.
The bed was short. The people in it were not. The people were sleeping at an angle. That is the story. The manuscript evidence for the propped-up sleeping position extends across several centuries and multiple cultural traditions within the medieval world, which is the kind of consistency that establishes a practice as genuinely widespread, rather than as the habit of a specific time or place. The illuminated manuscripts of the 12th century show it. The manuscripts of the 13th and 14th century show it. The Flemish paintings of the 15th century show it.
The Italian manuscript illustrations of the same period show it. The English miniatures, the French miniatures, the German and Dutch illuminated texts, all of them, when they depict a person in bed, depict a person who is not flat.
The specific medical text that most explicitly addresses the sleeping position is the regimen sanitatis, the regime of health, a genre of medical literature that provided practical guidance for maintaining health through the proper management of the 6 non-natural things that Galenic medicine identified as the primary determinants of health: air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, evacuation and repletion, and the passions of the soul.
The chapters on sleep in the various versions of the regimen sanitatis, which circulated in many versions across medieval Europe and was one of the most widely read categories of medical literature, consistently address the position of sleep. The head should be elevated. The right side is preferred over the left for the first part of the night. Lying flat is to be avoided. The reason given for the preference for the right side in the first part of the night was the specific humoral logic of digestion.
The liver, in the Galenic anatomy, was positioned on the right side of the body, and the digestion of food was a process that occurred under the liver's governance. Lying on the right side in the first part of the night, when the evening meal was still being digested, positioned the liver above the stomach and allowed the digestive process to proceed correctly.
In the second part of the night, when the digestion was complete, the left side was acceptable. The specific angle of the elevated head position was not a single prescribed angle, but a range within which the individual was to find their own comfort, guided by the medical principle that the head should be higher than the stomach. The bolsters and pillows that achieved this elevation were therefore not a luxury add-on to the sleeping arrangement. They were medical equipment, the specific material means of implementing the medical prescription for correct sleep posture. The wills and the inventories that list the bed equipment of medieval households across the social spectrum show the bolster appearing consistently, even in the modest household that had few other expensive items. A single bed of modest quality might have one bolster and one pillow. A better household would have two bolsters and two or three pillows. The wealthiest households had multiple bolsters of different sizes, various numbers of pillows, and the specific covers for each that were listed separately in the inventory. The construction of the bolster, the cylindrical roll of linen stuffed with wool or feathers, was simple enough that it could be produced in any household with the textile skills to make it, which was most households. The specific firmness and size that produced the correct sleeping angle was learned through practice and adjusted over time. The experienced bolster maker knew that a firmer bolster held its shape through the night better than a softer one, and that the correct height was the height that allowed the head to be elevated without creating strain in the neck.
The medical prescription for the sleeping position was not, of course, the only reason that people slept propped up. Practical experience had confirmed that the propped-up position was comfortable in a way that sleeping flat in a bed that was designed for the propped-up position was not. A bed with a gentle rake to its frame and a substantial bolster at the head was a bed that naturally invited the semi-upright position, and the person who tried to sleep flat in it would have found the geometry of the bed working against them.
The bed was short. The sleeping position made it functional. The medical theory made it correct. The practical experience made it comfortable. 3 independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion. The room, the medieval bedchamber, and who was in it. The bedroom in the medieval world was not a room for sleeping. This is the second fundamental misunderstanding that shapes the modern person's picture of medieval sleep, and it is as important as the misunderstanding about the sleeping position.
The modern bedroom is a room whose primary or exclusive function is sleep, a private space separated from the rest of the household, used for rest and for intimate activities, and for little else. The medieval equivalent space was not this. It was a room whose function was multiple, whose privacy was relative rather than absolute, whose relationship to the rest of the household was permeable in ways that the modern bedroom specifically is not.
The solar, the private room or suite of rooms at the upper level of a medieval great house, where the lord and lady of the household had their sleeping accommodation, was not private in the modern sense. It was relatively more private than the great hall, where the household gathered, but it was not private in the sense of being a space that only the occupants had access to. The lord's bedchamber was a place where trusted servants entered and worked, where petitioners might be received in the morning, where the business of the household was conducted in the hours after the lord rose, where children and guests and favored visitors might be present at various points in the day. The great bed, the principal bed of the household, the bed in which the lord and lady slept, was the most valuable piece of furniture in the house, in many cases more valuable than all the other furniture combined, and its presence in the room was not hidden or minimized. The bed was displayed.
The hangings that surrounded it, the canopy overhead, the curtains at the sides, the valance at the foot, were made from the finest fabrics the household could afford, embroidered and dyed and trimmed in ways that declared the wealth and the status of the owner.
The bed was not a private object. It was a public statement. The bed hangings served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were status symbols. The quality and the elaborateness of the hangings was a direct measure of the household's wealth, and visitors who were received in the bedchamber would read the hangings as easily as a modern person reads a car or a watch. They were practical insulation. The thick curtains drawn around the bed at night created a micro-environment that was significantly warmer than the rest of the room.
the sleeper's body heat being retained within the curtain space in a way that dramatically reduced the amount of additional heating required. And they were a form of privacy within a room that was not otherwise private. The drawn curtains created an enclosed space within the larger room, separating the sleeper from whatever activity might be occurring on the other side of the curtain.
The servants who slept in the Lord's bedchamber, on pallets on the floor, on benches, in the truckle bed that rolled out from under the great bed and served as the sleeping space for the most senior body servant, were not intrusions on the Lord's privacy. They were part of the sleeping arrangement. The Lord who slept entirely alone, without servants within call, was the Lord who was sleeping insecurely, who could not summon assistance immediately if something happened in the night, who was not attended with the constant availability of service that his status required.
The gradations of proximity to the Lord's sleeping space were a map of the household's hierarchy. The body servant who slept in the truckle bed at the foot of the great bed was the most senior, the most trusted, the most intimate member of the household below the family. The servants who slept on pallets at the perimeter of the room were a rank below. The servants who slept in the antechamber outside the bedchamber door were a further rank below. The organization of sleep was the organization of the household hierarchy.
The great bed itself was often not permanently located in a single room. The wealthy medieval household was a mobile institution. The lord and his household moved between properties through the year, and the great bed moved with them. The bed was designed for disassembly and reassembly, its parts numbered or marked so that the servants who dismantled and reconstructed it could do so efficiently. The hangings were packed in specific ways to prevent damage. The mattresses were transported separately. The entire sleeping apparatus of the household was a logistical exercise that was managed by specific servants with specific skills. The chamber pot, the ceramic or metal vessel that served the toilet needs of the bedchamber's occupants, was managed by specific servants as well. The night soil of the lord and lady was not a matter of personal management. It was attended to by the body servants, emptied and cleaned as part of the regular service of the chamber.
The medieval bedroom's relationship to bodily functions was one of the ways in which it differed most dramatically from the modern bedroom. Not more private, but differently managed. The intimate functions of the body being not hidden, but delegated. The women's sleeping arrangements in the great medieval household were similarly organized around the principle of attended rather than solitary sleep. The lady of the household slept with her ladies-in-waiting, who occupied the chamber with her and who were her attendants through the night as well as through the day.
The specific management of who slept where in the ladies' chambers was as carefully organized as the management of the lord's chamber, and the proximity to the lady was as much a matter of status as the proximity to the lord. The children of the household slept in their own spaces. The nursery for infants and young children, managed by the nurse and the servants of the nursery. The children's chamber for older children, supervised by their tutors or the household servants assigned to their care. The separation of children from their parents for sleep was standard in the medieval great household, not because of any theory about children's developmental needs, but because the organization of the household required it. The room shaped the sleep. The sleep organized the household, and the household was always in the room. The mobility of the medieval great household is a feature of medieval life that the modern person finds surprising, because the modern assumption about a great house is that it is a fixed seat, a permanent residence in which the family lives continuously. The medieval reality was different. The great lord and his household moved between properties through the year, following a circuit that was determined by the need to consume the agricultural surplus of each estate before moving on to the next, by the political calendar that required attendance at court, by the seasonal character of specific activities such as hunting, and by the practical reality that a household of several hundred people staying in one place through the whole year
consumed its resources faster than they could be replenished.
This mobility shaped the design and the organization of everything in the household, including the sleeping arrangements. The bed that was designed for disassembly and reassembly was the bed that served a mobile household. The hangings that were designed to be packed without damage were the hangings that survived the journey. The mattresses that could be rolled and strapped to a pack horse were the mattresses that arrived at the next property in usable condition. The servants who managed this movement were skilled logisticians.
The yeoman of the chamber, who had responsibility for the contents of the lord's bedchamber, supervised the dismantling and packing of the sleeping apparatus with a precision that the frequency of the household's movements required. The numbering of the bed's components, the marks cut into the wood or the painted numbers on the joints, allowed the assembly team at the destination to reconstruct the bed correctly from the marks without the need for instructions.
The chamber itself at each property was prepared in advance of the household's arrival. The local household staff, or the riding officers who preceded the main household, cleaned and aired the chambers, arranged the furniture, and prepared the rooms for occupation. The great bed was assembled in the chamber that had been designated for the lord sleeping, the servants working from the marks on the components, the hangings being hung and adjusted, the mattresses brought in and laid in the correct order, the sheets and blankets and coverlets applied in their proper sequence.
The result was that the lord arrived at a property and found his sleeping arrangements already constructed, already familiar, because they were his own bed and his own bedding that had made the journey with him. The continuity of the sleeping environment across the different properties of the circuit was a form of psychological stability that the mobile household maintained deliberately. The same bed, the same smell of the lavender in the linen, the same weight of the blankets, the same enclosed space within the drawn curtains, wherever the household happened to be.
The permanent domestic staff of each property, the staff who remained when the lord and his household moved on, slept in entirely different circumstances. The permanent cook, the permanent groom, the permanent household servants who maintained each property between visits slept in the sleeping arrangements appropriate to their status and their circumstances, which might range from a shared bed in a servant's dormitory to a simple pallet in whatever space was available. The great bed was for the lord and the household that moved with him. The fixed staff made do with what the property provided.
The women's chambers on the circuit followed the same pattern. The ladies-in-waiting who moved with the lady of the household managed their own sleeping arrangements with the same logistical discipline, though typically with less elaborate equipment. The ladies' bedchamber at each property was prepared with the ladies' own bedding and hangings, creating the same continuity of environment that the lord's chamber provided. The continuity was the point. In a world of constant movement, the familiar sleeping environment was an anchor, the thing that was the same regardless of where the household had traveled. The short bed, the bolsters, the familiar smell of the drawn curtains, the known weight of the blankets, these were home, wherever home happened to be that night. The night, darkness, 2 sleeps, and the midnight watch. The medieval night was not simply the absence of daylight. It was a different kind of time, a time that had its own character, its own dangers, its own social organization, and its own relationship to the biological rhythms of the human body that shaped the sleep that happened within it.
To understand how medieval people slept, you need to understand what the medieval night was, which requires setting aside almost everything that the modern person assumes about the night, based on their experience of a world illuminated by electricity. The darkness of the medieval night was absolute, in a way that the modern person, surrounded by the ambient light of a populated world, can barely reconstruct in imagination. The medieval town at night was a place of genuine darkness, the kind of darkness in which you could not see your hand in front of your face.
in which navigation by memory of familiar routes was the only navigation available, in which the person who stepped outside without a light was in genuine danger of falling, of getting lost, of encountering the various dangers that the darkness concealed. The countryside was darker still.
The medieval villager whose house was in the center of the village, surrounded by other houses, had some ambient light from the fires and candles of their neighbors. The isolated farmstead had nothing but the stars and the moon and whatever light leaked through the shutters of the house. This darkness had social consequences. The night was the time of things that were not permitted in the day, of theft, of violence, of the movement of people who had reasons for not being seen.
The medieval city imposed curfews. The word comes from the Old French couvre-feu, cover the fire, the instruction to extinguish hearth fires at night that was originally a fire safety measure and became a general regulation of nocturnal movement.
The night watch was a genuine institution, not a ceremonial one. Men whose specific function was to patrol the streets after dark and to challenge anyone whose movements seemed suspicious. The night was also the time of illness and of death in the medieval imagination. The medical theory of the period held that certain diseases were more active at night, that the cooling of the body in sleep made it more vulnerable to the miasmas and the imbalanced humours that caused illness.
The overnight deterioration of a patient who had been stable during the day was a well-documented clinical pattern, not because night was inherently more dangerous medically, but because the cooling of the body during sleep, the slowing of the circulatory processes, and the reduced monitoring that sleep permitted all created conditions where the overnight period was genuinely a time of higher medical risk. The historian
Roger A. Kirch, whose research on pre-industrial sleep transformed the historical understanding of how medieval people slept, demonstrated through the systematic analysis of hundreds of primary sources, diaries, court records, medical texts, literary accounts, that the standard sleep pattern of the medieval and early modern world was not the consolidated 8-hour block that modern people consider normal. It was a biphasic sleep, a first sleep that began at dark and lasted for several hours, followed by a period of waking that lasted for an hour or two around midnight, followed by a second sleep that continued until dawn. The period of waking between the two sleeps, which Eckertz called the watch or the watching, using the medieval terminology, was not insomnia. It was a recognized, named, socially accommodated period that had its own activities and its own character.
People used it for prayer, the nocturnal prayer that was part of the religious practice of the period, the matins of the monastic tradition being an institutionalized version of the natural midnight waking. For intimate conversation, the darkness and the quiet and the privacy of the drawn bed curtains, making the period between the two sleeps the most genuinely private time of the medieval day.
For sex, which the medical literature of the period considered most appropriate in the period between the two sleeps, when the body had been rested by the first sleep but was not yet returned to the second. And for thought and reflection, the medieval equivalent of the 3 a.m. thoughts that the modern person who wakes at that hour and cannot return to sleep recognizes. The practice of lying awake between the two sleeps was not experienced as a failure of sleep. It was experienced as a feature of the night, an expected and accommodated part of the temporal structure of the dark hours. The person who woke at midnight was not a person who was sleeping badly. They were a person who was on schedule. Their cultural framework told them that this was the appropriate state for this hour, and they used the time in the ways that the culture had developed for it. The implications for the understanding of modern insomnia are significant and have been noted by sleep researchers who have encountered Eckertz's work.
The person who wakes at 2 or 3 in the morning and cannot immediately return to sleep, who lies awake for an hour or two before eventually returning to sleep, and who experiences this as a distressing failure of their sleep, may be experiencing the natural biphasic sleep pattern of the human species, misidentified as pathological because the cultural framework that normalized it has disappeared. The anxiety produced by lying awake in the modern context, the catastrophizing about the failure to sleep, the awareness of the alarm that will sound in a few hours, the rumination that the quiet enables, is not a natural consequence of waking at night. It is the consequence of waking in a culture that has defined this as a problem.
The quality of the darkness also changed through the night in ways that the medieval person experienced and the modern person largely does not. The fire that burned in the great hall or in the kitchen, that had been the household's primary light source in the evening, was banked for the night, but not extinguished, a practice that maintained the embers and reduced the fuel consumption, while preserving the ability to rebuild the fire quickly in the morning. The faint orange glow of the banked fire was the ambient light of the medieval night, and the quality of that light, warm, dim, flickering, was the background against which the darkness was experienced. The sounds of the medieval night were different from the sounds of the modern night. The absolute absence of mechanical noise, no traffic, no refrigerator hum, no distant air conditioning, no white noise of the populated world, meant that the natural sounds of the night were fully audible. The owls, the foxes, the wind in the thatch, the occasional sound of animals in the byre, the watchman's footsteps on the street outside. These sounds were not intrusions on the silence. They were the texture of the night, familiar and expected, and in their own way reassuring. The sounds that told you the world was continuing in its normal way while you slept. The medieval night was long, dark, cold, and full. It was not something to be survived. It was a time with its own logic, and its own pleasures, and its own necessary activities. The sleep that happened within it was shaped by it in ways that the modern understanding of sleep, as a single consolidated block aimed at 8 hours and achieved or failed in a single uninterrupted stretch, does not accommodate. The medieval person went to sleep in a world that was genuinely dark, in a bed that was genuinely warm, in a room full of other people, sleeping at an angle that medicine prescribed and practice confirmed. And they woke in the middle of the night and used that time for prayer and love and thinking. And they went back to sleep, and they woke at dawn when the light came back. This was what sleeping was, and it was enough. The experience of the midnight watch, the natural waking period between the two sleeps that Roger E. Kirch's research has recovered from the historical record, was shaped by the specific conditions of the medieval night in ways that made it a genuine interlude rather than simply an interruption of sleep. The person who woke from the first sleep in the medieval period woke into a world that was dark, but not frightening, because the darkness was expected. The drawn curtains of the bed provided an immediate enclosed environment that was warm and familiar. The fire in the hearth, banked but not extinguished, provided a faint orange glow through the curtain fabric. The sounds of the household settling, the other sleepers in the chamber, the movement of animals in the byre, the night watch's footsteps on the street, were the familiar sounds of a world that was continuing normally. The medieval person who woke at midnight was not disoriented. They were on schedule, in the most literal sense. The schedule of the medieval night had a midnight period of waking built into it, and the body clock that had been calibrated by that schedule produced the waking at the expected time.
The cultural normalization of the midnight waking was so complete that the person who did not wake, who slept through the midnight period without interruption, was the exception rather than the norm. And some medical authorities of the period expressed mild concern about this as a sign of excessive heaviness of sleep.
The prayer that began the midnight watch was typically short. The specific prayers of the night office, the matins that the monastic tradition had institutionalized, and that the devout layperson performed in their own form at their own bedside. The prayer was a form of orientation, a reconnection with the theological framework that structured the medieval person's understanding of time and of the night's significance, a brief acknowledgement of the divine presence in the dark hours before the reflective interlude of the watch. The conversation that sometimes occupied the midnight watch was the most intimate conversation of the day. The darkness, the warmth of the shared bed, the absence of the social observation that the daylight hours brought, the specific quality of attention that the quiet of the night produced. These created conditions for a kind of talking that the day did not permit. The things said in the midnight watch were things said in the specific privacy of the dark, and the medieval people who kept diaries sometimes note the midnight conversations that they remember with a specific vividness that suggests the conditions produced memorable exchanges. The thinking of the midnight watch was similarly distinctive. The person who lay awake between the two sleeps, in the dark, was thinking in a state that the modern sleep researcher would describe as the hypnopompic state, the transitional condition between sleep and full waking, in which the normal filtering of thought is reduced and the associative connections between ideas are more fluid. The medieval description of this state as particularly receptive to spiritual inspiration, particularly lucid for prayer and reflection, is a description from the inside of the neurological state that the modern description describes from the outside. The return to sleep after the midnight watch was typically not effortful. The person who had spent an hour in quiet prayer and reflection in the warm darkness of the curtained bed was a person whose body had been resting for several hours and whose mind had been gently active rather than strenuously so. The second sleep came not as an achievement, but as a natural conclusion to the midnight interlude. The eyes closing again, the thoughts becoming less sequential, the body settling back into the deeper breathing of sleep.
The dawn that ended the second sleep was a biological event as well as a social one. The gradual increase of light as the sun rose, entering the room through the shuttered windows, increasing slowly over the half hour before full daylight, provided the light signal that the circadian system needed to end the sleep cycle. The person who woke at dawn was waking at the moment that their body clock and the external light environment agreed was the appropriate time to wake.
This agreement between the internal clock and the external signal, between the body's readiness and the world's readiness, is the specific quality of morning waking that the modern person who sets an alarm rarely experiences. The alarm interrupts a sleep cycle that may not have reached its natural conclusion. The dawn waking completes a sleep cycle that the body has been running to its natural end. The difference in the quality of the waking is real and is felt. The medieval night was structured to produce the natural waking. The modern night disrupts it.
The contents of the medieval bed were a material culture of extraordinary richness that the short, bare museum reproduction almost entirely fails to convey. The great bed of a wealthy medieval household was not the object that the museum visitor encounters. The wooden frame with its dusty hangings and its thin, flat mattress, looking like something that would be uncomfortable to sleep on for a single night. The great bed in use was a layered, constructed, inhabited object, a system of materials assembled with care and maintained with effort
that produced a sleeping environment of genuine comfort, warmth, and sensory richness that the stripped-down museum reproduction cannot communicate. The foundation layer was the bed frame itself, the heavy oak or walnut structure of posts and rails that supported everything above it, and that was itself an object of significant craftsmanship.
The turning on the posts, the joinery of the rails, the carving on the headboard, these were the work of skilled craftsmen who brought to the bed the same level of decorative attention that they brought to the other significant furniture of the household. The bed frame was not background. It was the structural expression of the household's investment in the object. Above the bed frame and below the mattress was the bedstead, the platform of wooden boards or the network of rope or leather interlacing that provided the base on which the mattress rested.
The rope bedstead was the more common arrangement in the medieval period. The ropes laced back and forth across the frame in a grid that provided a flexible, yielding surface.
The expression "sleep tight," which many people know as a traditional goodnight saying, is a reference to the tightening of these ropes, which loosened over time with use and had to be retensioned to maintain the firmness of the sleeping surface. The mattress that sat on the bedstead was typically not a single layer, but multiple layers of different materials. The bottom layer was often a wool or straw palliasse, a flat, firm layer that provided the structural base. Above this was the feather bed, the thick layer of down and feathers that provided the primary insulation and softness of the sleeping surface. The feather bed was the most expensive element of the medieval bed outfit and was the item most specifically mentioned in wills and inventories because it was the item most worth specifically mentioning. The feather bed was not a thin layer of feathers compressed between two sheets. It was a substantial object, thick enough to sink into, warm enough to maintain a comfortable temperature through a cold night, soft enough to conform to the body of the sleeper and provide the specific yielding support that the modern memory foam mattress attempts to replicate. The goose and duck down that filled a high-quality medieval feather bed was the same material that fills the best modern duvets, and it performed then, as it performs now, exceptionally. The sheets that covered the mattress layers were linen, the woven fabric produced from the flax plant that was the primary textile for body contact use in the medieval world. Linen had specific properties that made it ideal for bedding. It was smooth against the skin, it absorbed moisture from the body without retaining it, it could be washed and bleached to maintain its whiteness, and it lasted for many years with proper care. The white linen sheet was one of the signals of a well-managed household. Crisp, clean, white. It communicated the household's ability to maintain its standards. The blankets above the sheets were wool, the thick, heavy woolen blankets that provided the primary insulation of the sleeping arrangement. Multiple blankets were standard in the cold months, the number varying with the season and the severity of the weather. The wool blankets were not refined fabric. They were the heavy, dense material produced specifically for warmth, the felted surface resisting wind and cold, the wool fiber retaining its insulating capacity even when dampened by the moisture from the sleeper's body. Above the blankets was the coverlet, the decorative upper layer that was the public face of the bed. The coverlet was the layer visible to anyone who entered the room, and it was accordingly the layer that received the most attention to appearance. The coverlet of a wealthy household might be embroidered silk or velvet, trimmed with fur at the edges, worked with the household's heraldic devices. The coverlet of a modest household might be a plain woolen cloth. But in every case, the coverlet was the layer that declared the household's identity and its wealth, in the same way that the bed hangings declared the same things. The bed hangings, the canopy, the curtains, the valance, added the final layer to the sleeping environment. The drawn curtains created a tent within the room,
enclosing the sleeping space in a microenvironment that was heated by the sleeper's body heat and insulated by the thick fabric from the cold of the surrounding room. The interior of the drawn bed curtains at night was the warmest and most private space in a medieval household, and the experience of being inside the drawn curtains, warm, dark, enclosed, separated from the rest of the world by the thick fabric, was one of the specific sensory experiences of the medieval night that the modern person has almost no equivalent for.
The pillowcases that covered the pillows were embroidered or decorated in the wealthier households, the white linen of the pillowcase providing the ground for stitched patterns of flowers or animals or geometric designs that were visible when the bed was made in the morning.
The making of the bed, the reassembly of the layers and the smoothing of the sheets and the arrangement of the pillows and the straightening of the coverlet was a skilled task performed by specific servants in the wealthy household, and the made bed was an object that the household maintained as a demonstration of its orderliness and its standards. The smell of the medieval bed was not the smell that the museum visitor might imagine, of must and dust and old fabric. It was the smell of lavender, which was used to scent the linen and to repel insects, of rosemary, similarly used, of the specific clean smell of linen that had been washed and dried and pressed, of the wool of the blankets, of the wood of the bed frame and the resin used to treat it, of the candle or the oil lamp that provided the final light before sleep. The medieval bed, properly constructed and properly maintained, was a sensory environment of genuine luxury. The warmth of the feather bed and the blankets,
The softness of the down mattress, the smell of the lavender-scented linen, the darkness of the drawn curtains, the quiet of the household settling into sleep around you. It was not short because it was inadequate. It was short because you were not lying flat in it. You were leaning back, propped on your bolsters, in the warmth of your curtained enclosure, in the best-smelling room in the house, and you were, within your own framework, entirely comfortable. The specific provenance of the feathers that filled the medieval feather bed was a matter of practical and economic significance. The down of the eider duck, the specific down that we call eiderdown, gathered in Iceland and the Norse territories from the nests of the eider, where the female plucked it from her own breast to line the nest, was the most prized feather filling available in the medieval world. Eiderdown was gathered without harming the birds, the collectors taking only the excess down from the nest after the ducklings had hatched, and the sustainability of the practice was recognized in the Norse traditions that managed the eider colonies. The specific insulating quality of eiderdown, its ability to form clusters that trap air rather than compressing flat, its recovery from compression, its warmth to weight ratio, made it superior to other feather fillings. The less expensive goose down that filled the feather beds of the less wealthy was nonetheless a high-quality insulating material that performed well in the cold of the medieval bedroom. The geese kept on every medieval farm produced both food and bedding material, their feathers plucked at the periodic live plucking sessions that the farm calendar included, and their down separated from the stiffer flight feathers for use in the best bedding. The management of the feather supply, the plucking, the cleaning, the sorting, the storing of the feathers before use, was part of the agricultural management of the household, and was the responsibility of the housewife, who managed the domestic economy. The pillow ticking, the linen case that contained the feathers, was made from a specifically tightly woven linen that prevented the feathers from working through the fabric. The production of pillow ticking was a skilled weaving task, the tight weave requiring more care than the weave of ordinary linen, and producing a fabric that was correspondingly more expensive.
The inventory of a well-equipped household would distinguish between the pillow ticking and the ordinary linen of the sheets, the ticking being noted separately because of its specific character.
The covers that went over the pillows, the pillow cases that were visible when the bed was made, and that were the most decorative of the bed linens, were the work of the household needlewomen, embroidered with the household's colors or devices, or with purely decorative patterns of flowers and animals. The embroidery of the bed linens was one of the primary occupations of the women of the wealthy medieval household, a skilled craft that produced objects of genuine beauty that were also objects of daily domestic use. The maintenance of the feather bed required periodic attention. The feathers that had been in use for some time compacted and lost the lofting that gave the bed its warmth. The bed needed to be aired, taken outside on a dry, windy day, and exposed to the air and the sun, which freshened the feathers and restored some of their lofting. The case needed to be inspected for damage, and any feathers that had worked through small holes in the ticking needed to be pushed back and the hole repaired before more escaped.
The specific smell of a well-maintained medieval featherbed, the clean smell of washed linen, and the specific faint smell of the feathers themselves, overlaid with the lavender that was used to scent the bedding, was one of the sensory signatures of a well-ordered household. The smell of a poorly maintained featherbed, damp from inadequate airing, sour from accumulated body moisture, musty from the feathers that had not been refreshed, was the smell of a household that was not managing its domestic resources well.
The wooden chest at the foot of the bed, the marriage chest, the hope chest, the coffer that contained the best household linens, was the material repository of the household's investment in its sleeping arrangements. The linens stored in the chest were the reserve, the additional sheets and pillowcases and bolster covers that replaced the ones in use when they were taken for washing. The quality and quantity of the contents of the chest were a measure of the household's prosperity that any guest who saw the chest opened would read immediately. The bed was the household's most expensive asset. The contents of the chest were the household's most carefully maintained textiles. Together, they were the physical expression of the household's commitment to the specific quality of life that the medieval knight required. The ritual, how the medieval person went to bed. The ritual of going to bed in the medieval world was a ceremony, and ceremonies have structures that reveal what the people performing them consider important. The medieval bedtime ritual, the specific sequence of actions and prayers and physical preparations that preceded the act of sleep, was not a routine in the casual modern sense of the word. It was a formal sequence with recognized stages, each with its own purpose, that moved the person from the social space of the waking day into the private space of sleep, through a series of transitions that managed the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the passage as much as the physical ones. The hour of going to bed varied by the season, by the household, and by the individual. In the winter months, when the days were short and the household gathered inside earlier, bedtime might be not long after dark, perhaps 8 or 9 o'clock by modern reckoning. In summer, with the longer days and the extended hours of outdoor work and socializing, bedtime might be later.
The standard assumption of the medieval medical authorities that the body should sleep from somewhere around 10 at night until around 6 or 7 in the morning, with the midnight waking in the middle, produced a schedule that most households approximately observed.
The chamber pot was the first act of the bedtime ritual, the voiding of the bladder before sleep, which the medical authorities recommended for the obvious practical reason that a full bladder would interrupt sleep, and for the theoretical reason that the retention of urine overnight was associated with various humoral imbalances. The chamber pot was managed with discretion in wealthy households. The body servant's attendance on the master or mistress through the bedtime ritual
included the management of the chamber pot, with a professionalism that the modern person might find difficult to imagine, but that was simply part of the service. The washing of the hands and face was a standard element of the bedtime ritual in households that could afford the water and the equipment.
The wash basin and the ewers, the pitcher of water that was brought to the chamber for the washing, were standard items in inventories of wealthy bedchambers. The washing before bed had both practical and symbolic dimensions. It removed the physical traces of the day, and it enacted the psychological transition from the activity of the day to the quietness of sleep. The hair was prepared for sleep.
Women in the medieval world wore their hair covered during the day, the veil and the coif and the wimple being the standard head coverings of the period, and the removal of these coverings and the preparation of the hair for sleep was part of the bedtime ritual managed by the lady's maid. The hair was unplaited or uncombed depending on the specific custom, and a nightcap, the coif or the biggin that protected the head from the cold of the night, was typically applied before sleep.
The nightcap was standard equipment for both men and women in the medieval period, and its function was entirely practical rather than comic. The heat lost through the uncovered head in the cold of a medieval bedchamber was significant, and the nightcap maintained the head temperature through the night in the same way that the hat maintained it through the day.
The warming of the bed before entry, using a bed warmer, a covered metal pan filled with hot coals from the fire, which was moved between the sheets to warm the sleeping surface before the sleeper entered, was another standard practice in the wealthier households.
The prayers that concluded the bedtime ritual were not perfunctory. They were a formal element of the transition from waking to sleep that the religious culture of the medieval world had developed into a specific liturgical practice. The evening prayers, vespers, compline, had their specific texts and their specific gestures, and the person who performed them was not simply going through the motions of piety. They were using the prayer as a psychological tool. The specific words and the specific physical postures of the prayer practice, creating a cognitive and emotional transition that the modern person achieves through other means. The specific prayers for protection during the night, the commendation of the soul to God's keeping through the hours of sleep, the request for protection from the various dangers that the night was believed to harbor, were expressions of a genuine theological anxiety about sleep. Sleep was understood, in the medieval theological tradition, as a kind of death, the soul's temporary departure from active consciousness, during which the body was vulnerable, and the soul was in a state that the devil might exploit. The prayers that preceded sleep were a form of spiritual protection, and they were taken seriously. The positioning in the bed was deliberate.
The construction of the sleeping position, the arrangement of the bolsters, the placement of the pillows, the specific angle of elevation that the individual found comfortable and that the medical prescription recommended, was part of the ritual. The body servant who attended the master or mistress to bed had among their responsibilities the construction of the sleeping position, the arrangement of the bedclothing, the drawing of the curtains. The sleeper who entered the drawn curtains entered a space that had been prepared for them, that was already warm, that was arranged for the specific comfort of the person who was going to sleep in it. The dismissal of the servants, the final gesture of the bedtime ritual in the wealthy household, was the transition from attended to unattended sleep. The body servant who had managed the bedtime ritual withdrew, the curtains were drawn, and the sleeper was left in the enclosed warmth of the curtained bed.
The other servants who slept in the chamber, on their pallets, behind the curtain rather than within it, were present but not active, their presence a form of security rather than attendance. The first sleep came quickly to most people in the medieval period,
And there is a specific reason for this that the modern person who lies awake after going to bed should find of interest. The medieval person went to bed genuinely tired, in a way that the modern person frequently does not. The physical demands of a day of medieval life, the walking, the manual work, the carrying and the lifting, and the repetitive physical labor that was the substance of most medieval occupations, produced a physiological tiredness that made the transition to sleep direct rather than effortful. The body was ready for sleep because the day had genuinely exhausted it. The modern person who lies awake for an hour after going to bed is often a person whose body has not been genuinely tired by the day, whose physical activity has been insufficient to produce the deep tiredness that makes sleep immediate, whose mind is still active with the stimulation that the lit screens and the social media and the email of the modern evening have provided right up to the moment of trying to sleep. The medieval person had none of these problems. The day had been physical. The evening had been dim and quiet.
The preparations for sleep had been calm and ritual and deliberate. The body was ready. The curtains were drawn. The fire was banked. The household settled. And the first sleep began. The warming of the bed, the specific practice of preparing the sleeping surface for the sleeper's entry by introducing a source of heat before the sleeper got in, was widespread in the medieval world, and was a practice that the modern person who has experienced it recognizes as immediately, powerfully effective. The bed warmer, in its later form, was a covered metal pan with a long wooden handle, filled with coals from the hearth, and moved back and forth between the sheets in a sweeping motion that warmed the fabric without scorching it.
In the medieval period, similar effects were achieved with heated stones wrapped in cloth, with warming pans filled with hot embers, or with the simple expedient of having a servant enter the bed briefly to warm it with their own body heat before the master or mistress got in. The last practice is documented in the accounts of royal households, and was a specific service performed by specific servants who had this function among their duties. The psychology of entering a warm bed is not a trivial matter. The cold sheet that greets the body entering a cold bed produces a reflexive tension, the body bracing against the cold, the muscles contracting, the nervous system mobilizing the thermal defense responses that work against the relaxation that sleep required. The warm bed that greets the body produces the opposite, the muscles releasing, the body settling into the warmth, the nervous system signaling that the conditions are safe and comfortable, and that the transition to sleep is appropriate. The bed warmer was, in this physiological sense, a tool for inducing the relaxation that sleep required. The nightcap that protected the head from the cold of the medieval bedroom was not a single standardized item, but a category of head covering that varied considerably in its design and its materials. The simple linen coif, a close-fitting cap tied under the chin, was the most common form, worn by both men and women as the basic protection against the cold of the night. The more elaborate nightcap of the wealthier household might be of finer linen, might be embroidered, might be trimmed with a frill at the edge. The specific nightcap worn by a person was an item of personal significance. It was listed in inventories, left in wills, given as gifts. The nightgown, the specific garment worn during sleep rather than the daytime clothing that would be removed before bed, was a feature of the wealthier household sleeping arrangements and was not universal at all social levels. The poor might sleep in their undergarments or in whatever they wore during the day. The wealthy slept in the specific, loose, warm garment that the nightgown provided, the change of garments being one of the signals of the transition from the day to the sleep. The specific prayers that the medieval person said before sleep were organized into a sequence that moved from the general to the specific, from the acknowledgement of God and the saints
to the specific concerns of the household that needed to be commended to divine protection through the night. The health of the children, the success of the pending enterprise,
the safety of the husband or the wife who was traveling, the resolution of the specific anxiety that had been troubling the household. The prayers before sleep were the opportunity to place these concerns in a framework larger than the individual's management of them. And the act of doing so was psychologically effective in ways that the modern therapeutic tradition recognizes under different names. The dismissal of the servants at the end of the bedtime ritual was a specific moment of transition that the medieval household managed with its own ceremony.
The lord, who had been attended through the entire bedtime preparation, finally dismissed the attending servants with a specific gesture or a specific word, and the servants withdrew with their own formal acknowledgement of the dismissal. The moment of the curtains closing on the great bed was the moment at which the lord and the lady were alone, genuinely alone, within the enclosed space of the curtains, for the first time in the day.
This specific privacy was the privacy that the curtained bed was designed to create. And it was the privacy that made the enclosed bed so valuable in a household where genuine solitude was never otherwise available. The interior of the drawn curtains was the most private space in the medieval world for the person wealthy enough to have a properly equipped bed. What happened within that space was between the two people inside it and whatever divine presence they had invited into it through their prayers.
The first sleep that followed this preparation came, for the medieval person, as a natural consequence of everything that had preceded it. The physical tiredness of the day's work, the warmth of the prepared bed, the psychological relaxation of the prayers, the comfort of the familiar sleeping position, the enclosed security of the drawn curtains. The medieval bedtime ritual was a technology for inducing sleep. It was a very good one. The sharing of beds in the medieval world was so normal as to require no explanation in the primary sources, which is itself evidence of how normal it was. The thing about truly normal practices is that they go undocumented, because documentation is the record of things that are remarkable rather than things that are routine. The primary sources of medieval social history, the court records, the accounts, the diaries, the legal documents, mention bed sharing when it is relevant to whatever is being recorded, which means they mention it in contexts that are specific rather than general. But the accumulation of these specific mentions, combined with the physical evidence of the beds themselves and the architectural evidence of the spaces they occupied, produces a clear picture of a practice that was standard at every social level. The great bed of the medieval household was designed to accommodate multiple people. The width of the surviving great beds, some of them 3 meters or more across, is evidence of a design intention that was not about the size of individual sleepers. The Great Bed of Ware, which is the most famous surviving example of a large medieval bed, is approximately 3.5 meters wide and was reported to have accommodated multiple couples simultaneously. The bed was made as a curiosity, but the curiosity was in its extreme size, not in the principle of shared sleeping. The principle was familiar enough that the extreme version of it was the joke. The sharing of beds by people of the same sex who were not romantically involved was entirely standard and carried no social implication. The traveler who stopped at an inn was expected to share the inn's bed with whoever else was staying there. The servant who slept in the master's chamber shared the sleeping space with other servants in whatever arrangement the space permitted. The apprentice who slept in the workshop slept alongside the other apprentices, and sometimes alongside the master himself. The student at university slept 2 to a bed as standard, the doubling of the beds being the practical management of limited space in the colleges. The social gradations of who shared a bed with whom
were mapped onto the household hierarchy with the same precision that governed every other aspect of the household's organization.
The body servant, who slept in the truckle bed at the foot of the master's bed, was not in the master's bed. There was a meaningful distinction between being adjacent to the great bed and being in it. But the trusted companion, the close friend, the royal favorite who was invited to share the master's bed, was in a different relationship with the master than the servant who slept on the floor. The bed was a social space as well as a sleeping space, and proximity within it was a measure of intimacy and trust. The intimacy of shared sleeping was understood and valued in the medieval world, without the self-consciousness that the modern person brings to the subject. The warmth of another body was a practical resource in a world without central heating. Two people under the same blankets maintained a warmer sleeping environment than a single person under the same blankets. This was not sentiment, it was thermodynamics. The sharing of beds was a survival practice as much as a social one, and the social comfort that accompanied the sharing was an additional benefit rather than the primary purpose.
The children of the medieval household slept in shared sleeping arrangements from birth. The infant was typically in the same bed as the nurse who cared for it, a practice that the church periodically tried to discourage because of the risk of overlaying, the accidental suffocation of the infant by the adult sleeping beside it. The prohibition on sharing beds with infants appears regularly in medieval penitentials and church documents, which tells us that the practice continued despite the prohibition, and that it was considered normal enough to require repeated discouragement.
The older children of the household slept in shared beds with siblings or with other children of the household, the arrangement being managed by the servants or tutors responsible for the children's care. The transition from the children's shared sleeping space to the adult shared sleeping arrangements happened gradually and without any specific ceremony. It was simply the natural progression of a world in which sleeping alone was the exception rather than the rule. The inn was the most promiscuous context for bed sharing, and the accounts of inn sleeping from the medieval and early modern period are both vivid and revealing. The traveler who arrived at an inn was allocated a place in whatever bed or beds were available, the allocation being managed by the innkeeper with an eye to accommodating the maximum number of guests in the available space. The specific arrangements that resulted, strangers of different nationalities, different social classes, different languages, sharing a bed in an inn, produced the comedies and the discomforts that appear in the literature of the period as both the source of genuinely amusing anecdotes and as evidence of a practice so routine that it could be laughed about rather than condemned. The warmth of the shared bed in winter was the warmth of community, the specific, reliable warmth of other bodies that the medieval world depended on in ways that the modern world does not.
The house that was cold was the house that gathered its inhabitants together, that pulled the beds closer to the fire, that brought the children into the adult beds when the temperature fell particularly low.
The cold was not merely a physical challenge. It was a social organizer, forcing the togetherness that the cold required and that the humans in the cold typically preferred to the alternative. The loneliness of sleeping alone, which the modern world has normalized to the point where it requires no comment, was not the normal condition of the medieval person. The normal condition was the shared sleeping space, the other bodies in the bed or in the room, the social presence of the household through the night.
The person who slept alone in the medieval world was a person in unusual circumstances, traveling, isolated, a member of a religious community that had specific rules about solitary sleep. The standard was company.
The modern epidemic of loneliness, the research findings that show approximately 1 in 3 adults in developed countries reporting meaningful loneliness, is partly the loneliness of sleeping alone, in beds that are large enough for two, and rooms that are private in ways that medieval rooms were not, in a world that has made solitary sleep the default, without examining whether the default produces the outcomes that sleeping is for. The medieval bed was wide because it was shared. The sharing was the point. The warmth was the result. The specific language that the medieval sources use to describe bed sharing is one of the ways in which the historian can track the practice across different social contexts and different periods. The Latin and the vernacular texts of the period use terms that distinguish between different relationships between bed sharers, terms that indicate the intimacy or the lack of intimacy of the arrangement, the social equality or inequality of the sharers, the intended duration, and the social meaning of the sharing. The bedfellow, the person who regularly shared your bed, was a relationship term that carried a specific social weight. The bedfellow was not simply someone who happened to be in the same bed. The bedfellow was someone with whom you had an established sleeping relationship, someone whose sleeping habits were familiar to you and whose presence was expected rather than incidental. The term appears in the social vocabulary of the medieval and early modern period with a frequency that reflects the normality of the relationship it describes. The inn-sleeping situation was documented with particular vividness by the various travelers and diarists of the medieval and early modern period, who found themselves in inns and who had reason to note the specific arrangements of the beds and the bedmates they encountered. The accounts range from the matter-of-fact, a simple record of having shared the bed with whoever else was staying at the inn, to the comedic, detailed descriptions of the specific discomforts and misunderstandings that arose from sharing a bed with an unknown stranger of different habits and different size. The regulation of inn-sleeping was a matter that authorities occasionally tried to address. The inn that crammed too many guests into a single bed, 5 or 6, where 2 or 3 was the reasonable maximum, was an inn that was exceeding the comfort of its guests in the interest of its profits. The specific complaints about inn-sleeping that appear in the legal and administrative records of the period are not complaints about sharing beds per se, but complaints about the excessive crowding that some inns enforced. The social contract of shared sleeping, the implicit understanding between bedmates about the mutual management of the shared space, was enforced by the community norms that regulated social behavior in the other shared spaces of medieval life. The bedmate who thrashed and kicked and disturbed their bedfellow's sleep was the bedmate who attracted negative social comment. The bedmate who maintained their own portion of the shared space without intruding on the others was the bedmate who fulfilled the social contract. The specific physics of shared sleeping were well understood by the medieval person who shared beds regularly, which was essentially everyone. The warm patch on the mattress left by a previous occupant, the specific arrangement of the blankets that accommodated 2 bodies rather than 1, the management of the shared pillow arrangement, the specific negotiation of the level of the blankets at the foot of the bed, where 2 people of different sizes needed different amounts of coverage. These practical details of shared sleeping were part of the everyday knowledge of the medieval person and were managed without conscious effort by people who had been sharing beds since childhood. The loss of the bedfellow, through death, through the departure on a journey, through the dissolution of a household, was experienced as a physical as well as an emotional loss. The accounts of widows and widowers in the medieval period sometimes describe the specific physical experience of sleeping alone in the bed that had been shared. The cold side, the absence of the familiar weight and warmth, the strangeness of the space that had always been occupied by another body. The physical dimension of the grief was not separate from the emotional dimension. It was one of its expressions. The wide medieval bed that accommodated multiple sleepers was not wide because medieval people thought that everyone deserved more space. It was wide because multiple people were expected to use it simultaneously, and the width required to do so with reasonable comfort was the width that the bed was made to. The short bed and the wide bed were both responses to the specific practice of the medieval sleeping arrangement, the short bed reflecting the angled sleeping position, the wide bed reflecting the shared use. The two dimensions together produced an object that looks, to the modern eye, oddly proportioned, wider than it is long in some cases, or at least approximately square in the great beds that accommodated the most people. To the medieval eye, the proportions were functional. The bed was the right shape for the sleep that happened in it,
which is all that a bed needs to be. The dreams. What sleep meant in the medieval world. The dreams of the medieval sleeper were not the private psychological residue of the day that modern sleep science understands them to be. They were messages. The understanding of dreams in the medieval world was embedded in a theological and philosophical framework that gave dreams a significance that the modern understanding of them as the brain's overnight processing of emotional and experiential material does not accommodate. Dreams, in the medieval framework, could be divinely inspired, communications from God or the saints that carried genuine information about the future, about spiritual matters, about the specific guidance that the dreamer required. They could be demonically inspired, communications from evil forces designed to tempt or mislead the dreamer. They could be natural, the products of the body's humoral state during sleep, the specific content of the dream reflecting the specific humoral condition of the dreamer. And they could be random noise, the meaningless productions of a sleeping mind that should not be attended to.
The classification of dreams, the determination of which category a specific dream fell into, and whether its contents should be acted upon, was a recognized intellectual discipline in the medieval period, with its own literature and its own authorities. The classification system derived ultimately from the ancient Greek tradition, transmitted through the Church Fathers and the medieval commentators, and it provided a framework for thinking about dreams that was simultaneously theological and what we might now call psychological. The dreams that the medieval person most feared were the nightmare. Not the bad dream in the modern sense, but the specific visitation of the mare, the demon that was believed to sit on the sleeper's chest during the night and produce the specific experience of pressure and paralysis that the modern sleep scientist recognizes as sleep paralysis. The mare visited the sleeper who had eaten too much or too richly before bed, whose digestive humours were in a state that invited the visitation. The preventive measures, the specific prayers, the specific amulets, the specific sleeping positions that were believed to discourage the mare were a significant element of the medieval bedtime preparation. Sleep paralysis, the experience of waking from sleep while the body is still in the paralyzed state that REM sleep produces, often accompanied by hallucinations and a sense of presence in the room, is a well-documented neurological phenomenon that is not dangerous, but is deeply alarming to those who experience it. The medieval understanding of this experience as a demonic visitation was not a failure of understanding. It was an attempt to make sense of a genuinely strange and frightening experience using the conceptual frameworks available, and the specific descriptions of the mare's visitation in the medieval literature correspond closely to the phenomenology of sleep paralysis that the modern sleep researcher describes. The good dreams, the divinely inspired communications that the dreamer was meant to attend to, were distinguished from the other categories by their clarity, their vividness, and their specific content. The dream that came in the form of a clear image or a clear message, particularly if it appeared to come from a recognizable divine figure or saint, was potentially meaningful and should be taken seriously. The process of interpreting such dreams, consulting with a priest or a confessor, praying for clarity about the dream's meaning, acting on the guidance if the interpretation was sufficiently clear, was a standard element of the medieval spiritual life. The oneiromantic tradition, the interpretation of dreams for predictive or divinationary purposes, was officially disapproved of by the Church, but widely practiced. The dream books that circulated in the medieval period, lists of dream images with their predicted meanings, were the popular expression of this tradition. The person who had dreamed of a specific animal or a specific action or a specific color consulting the book for the interpretation. The Church's disapproval did not prevent the circulation of these books, because the desire to understand the meaning of dreams is apparently robust against official discouragement.
The sleep that the medieval person entered at the end of the bedtime ritual, the propped-up, curtained, shared sleep in the short bed, was therefore not the simple biological process that the modern person's relationship to sleep suggests.
It was an entry into a realm that had its own rules and its own significance and its own dangers. The prayers that preceded sleep were not merely comforting habits. They were preparations for a journey into a domain that was genuinely uncertain, that could produce genuine guidance or genuine spiritual danger, depending on the quality of the preparation and the condition of the soul.
The waking in the middle of the night, the midnight watch that separated the two sleeps, was the moment at which the dreams of the first sleep could be assessed and reflected upon. The person who woke at midnight and spent their waking hour considering the dreams they had just had, praying about them, discussing them with the person beside them, was engaging with the dream in a way that the immediate post-dream waking permitted, and that the consolidated sleep morning waking, which puts significant time between the dream and the reflection, does not. The second sleep was preceded by the second round of prayers, shorter than the bedtime prayers, more focused, the specific concerns of the night and the dreams of the first sleep being the subjects of a brief intercession before the return to sleep. The person who fell back to sleep after the midnight watch fell back into a state that they understood as different from the first sleep. The second sleep was the deep, restorative sleep from which they would wake at dawn, the sleep from which the dreams, if they came, were the most significant and most trustworthy. The long sleep of the medieval night, 2 periods of sleep separated by an hour of waking, totaling perhaps 7 or 8 hours in a long winter night, was a biologically natural pattern that the architecture of the night, the social organization of the sleeping space, and the theological understanding of dreams all supported and reinforced. It was not the sleep of people who had not yet understood what sleep was for. It was the sleep of people who had developed, over centuries of practice and observation, a relationship with the night and with sleep that was embedded in their culture and their theology and their social organization in ways that the modern understanding of sleep, as a single consolidated block aimed at 8 hours, managed pharmaceutically when it fails, stripped of its cultural and spiritual dimensions, has not replaced. The medieval bed was short because the medieval sleeper was not lying flat in it. The medieval sleeper was not lying flat because the medical theory of the period held that lying flat was dangerous, and the practical experience of the period had found that propped-up sleeping was comfortable, and the specific character of the medieval night, the 2 sleeps, the midnight watch, the prayers, the dreams, made the semi-upright position the natural posture for the person who would be waking in the middle of the night to pray and reflect before returning to sleep. The medieval night was not a simple thing. It was structured and inhabited and meaningful in ways that the modern night is not. The bed reflected that complexity. Short, warm, shared, curtained, elevated, inhabited. This was how they slept. And they slept, by the available evidence, rather well. Sleep well. The curtains are drawn, The fire is banked. The household is quiet. The first sleep is beginning. You know what to do. The specific dream tradition of the medieval world produced a literature of dream interpretation that was as extensive and as varied as any other genre of medieval writing. And the analysis of this literature reveals the specific anxieties and hopes and theological concerns of the culture that produced it. The biblical tradition that the medieval dream literature drew on was a tradition in which dreams of genuine divine significance had appeared repeatedly. The dreams of Joseph, the dreams of Pharaoh, the dream of Jacob, the dream of Solomon, the various prophetic dreams of the Old Testament, and the New Testament's account of Joseph being warned in a dream to flee to Egypt with the infant Jesus. This tradition established that dreams could carry genuine divine communication, and the medieval inheritor of this tradition could not dismiss dreams entirely without dismissing a significant portion of the scriptural record. The Church's position on dreams was therefore necessarily nuanced. The official line was that some dreams were significant, those that came from God, and most dreams were not. The practical problem was that the test for distinguishing the significant from the insignificant was not simple, and the dream that a person found compelling, whether because of its vividness or its apparent relevance to their waking concerns, was a dream that was difficult to dismiss, regardless of what the official position on dream interpretation was. The medical tradition added its own layer to the dream interpretation framework. The humoral theory of dreams, in which the specific content of a dream reflected the specific humoral condition of the dreamer, provided a natural, non-supernatural account of most dream content that coexisted with the theological account without entirely supplanting it. A dream of blood and heat indicated an excess of blood. A dream of cold and dark indicated a prevalence of black bile. The physician who asked a patient about their dreams was gathering clinical information about the patient's humoral state, as much as the theologian who asked about dreams was gathering information about the patient's spiritual state. The dream books that circulated in the medieval period were compilations of the oniromantic tradition, lists of dream images with their predicted meanings, organized alphabetically or thematically, providing the lay reader with a reference for the interpretation of specific dream content. The alphabetical organization of many dream books, entry for abbot, entry for abbey, entry for acorn, working through the letters, reflects an approach to the material that prioritized convenience of reference over theoretical coherence, and the sheer volume of entries in the more extensive dream books reflects the practical demand for guidance about specific dream images. The specific dreams that the medieval person most valued, the divinely inspired dream that provided genuine guidance, were understood to have specific qualities that distinguished them from the ordinary products of a sleeping mind. They were clear rather than confused. They were memorable. They did not fade on waking in the way that most dreams do. They came to the sleeper in a specific state, the state that the medical tradition identified as the most receptive to significant dreams, which was the state between the first and second sleep, the hypnopompic state of the midnight watch. They involved figures or voices that were recognizable as authoritative, saints, angels, divine figures. The recording of significant dreams was a practice that the spiritual advisors of the medieval period encouraged. The confessor, or the spiritual director, who received the account of a potentially significant dream and helped the dreamer interpret its meaning, was performing a specific pastoral function that the dream tradition had institutionalized. The journals of the spiritually inclined medieval person, the records kept by nuns and monks and the devout laity who maintained spiritual journals, include dream accounts with a frequency that reflects the value placed on dreaming as a spiritual activity. The modern person who dismisses the medieval dream tradition as superstition is dismissing a tradition that was engaged with genuine questions about the meaning of mental life,
about the relationship between the waking and the sleeping self, about the significance of the images and narratives that the sleeping mind produced. These are not questions that the modern understanding of dreams has fully resolved, despite the neurological and psychological research that has been brought to bear on them. The REM cycles and the memory consolidation functions that modern sleep science identifies are accurate descriptions of what happens neurologically during sleep.
They are not complete descriptions of what sleep means to the person having it. The medieval tradition was wrong about the mechanism of dreams. It was not wrong to think that dreams mattered. And the bed in which those dreams occurred, the short, warm, curtained, shared, bolstered, feather-filled bed, was the specific material environment in which the medieval person's nightly encounter with the night's possibilities took place.
Short bed, rich night. The dimensions of the bed were never the measure of the experience inside it. That was history in sleep. If you made it here, or if you drifted away somewhere around the bolsters and the bed curtains and the midnight watch, I am glad you were here, either way. Like the video if the medieval bed is now a completely different object in your mind. Subscribe so you never run out of history to fall into. And leave me a comment when you wake up.
Tell me where you are and what time it is. I always want to know who was out there with me tonight. Next week, another long, slow night of history. Until then, rest well. Adjust your pillows. You were supposed to be more propped up than that.